Welcome to The Pause, a podcast that dives deep into the biotech stories and feature biotech leaders. I'm your host, Fang Xie.
I'm your other host, Yusuf Baidi.
The podcast is brought to you by the Harvard Biotech Club, a student-led, Harvard-affiliated biotech organization on a mission to bridge the gap between academia and the industry.
Today's guest is Peter Kolchinsky. Peter is co-founder and managing partner of RA Capital, a leading biotech venture capital firm with $11 billion investments under its management. Peter is a trained virologist from Harvard Medical School, and for listeners who might not know, Peter co-founded our club when he was a PhD student. Peter is not only a successful biotech investor, but also a compassionate social activist for patients who can't afford the drugs they need. In his book, The Great American Drug Deal, Peter proposed an actionable solution to make drugs affordable while continuing to make biomedical innovations. During the dark hours of the COVID pandemic, Peter established No Patient Left Behind, a nonprofit organization advocating for drug price reform. We couldn't be more excited to have Peter Kolchinsky on today's show. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks very much for having me, guys. Pretty cool being on this first episode.
Yeah, we couldn't imagine a better guest to have on the debut. So for people that don't know too much about you, could tell us a bit about yourself, where you're from, some background on yourself.
Sure. I'm a first-generation American. Is that what you say it when you came over here from another country? Right? And my parents were really hardworking, and I grew up watching them really make good on the American dream, I'd say, right? In particular, I want to give my dad credit for planting the idea of becoming, a scientist going into biology, taking an interest in biotech. I was, probably 12 or 13 or whatever when he first said, I did the whole computer thing, that was good for me, but I feel like it's past, and really biotech is the future, right? And I totally did not see tech for what we know it to be today. But that's okay. That was in the early 90s. And he saw biotech. And I just thought, great, thanks for the direction. That's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to focus on. And I absorbed everything I could as a kid about biology. And I remember my high school had a recombinant DNA class that I took, and I extracted a plasmid or something, and that was super cool, right? So I saw the movie Outbreak, and it looked like a really cool thing to do, to get dressed up in spacesuits and play with Ebola. And that's how I decided that I want to be a virologist. So I think a key thing to take away from that is that while I always knew what I wanted to do, I always had purpose, what my next step would be, it wasn't always that well thought out. And I'm going to make the case to you that out of 1,000 parallel universes, my impulses did not naturally lead me to the same outcome that you see here. There's a lot of luck that went into my career. So I'm glad I saw Outbreak and not, some other movie about something, that was less relevant to what my career turned out to be. Harvard had a ton of virologists. So, coming out of college, I wanted to go to Harvard. 40 virology labs. That's kind of a dumb way to think about it, really, because you only get to work in one laboratory. It doesn't matter that there's 40. But somehow it just felt to me that I would be more likely to find the right research project at a school that had the most number of virologists out there. And I ended up working on HIV. I had to choose between actually an HIV lab and a herpes lab. And the way I looked at it is that I think this is still true. HIV has 11 genes, and herpes has 200. And I was I think it's more likely that I will be able to wrap my head around HIV than I have to wrap my mind around herpes. And I started doing research in the laboratory, and the vision that I had in my head was, all right, I love the movie Outbreak, and I love the example my dad set for me, where as a computer hardware engineer, he had invented some of his own technology, started a company around it, and I watched him build a business in our basement. And my mom got in on it and helped him, build a business as well. Both my parents were entrepreneurs, and I saw becoming the CEO of a company developing a technology I invented to be the pinnacle of anything I could aspire to. That was my North Star. And it didn't take long, by the way, in the lab for me to realize that I'd better be ready to accept an entire career of failure in the hopes of a chance that maybe that vision would come true. And I wasn't willing to accept that. I wasn't willing to take the chance that I would, start pursuing some sort of novel line of research, and it would end up, just a bunch of empty holes. In other words, I don't think I was really ready to accept, science in its rawest form. If you're not willing to fail for your whole career and simply offer up the lessons that emerge from failure so that somebody else can, achieve a breakthrough, then you're probably not really fully cut out to be a scientist, through and through for the rest of your career. So I figured that if I want to make a contribution to humanity, help invent some sort of medicine, help bring some sort of medicine to market, I'd better learn some skills, maybe business skills, that would allow me to help those people who have achieved a breakthrough of their own, something that increases the odds that they will succeed. And maybe I'll get to work with 10 such people over my career, and maybe one or two of them, will have something that turns into a real medicine, and I'll be able to look back and say, I contributed to that, right? So I pivoted. All right, I'm not going to be CEO of a company based on a technology I invent, but that's okay. I will still aspire to be CEO of a successful company that brings a medicine or two to market. How am I going to learn to be a CEO of a biotech company? I should learn something about biotech. Well, there was an organization at the time at Harvard Medical School called the Harvard Medical School Business Association, HMSBA. I just looked it up right before this. I don't think it exists anymore. But I went to them after I attended one of their events, and I was like, hey, I have an idea for a hands-on way for people to learn about biotech utilizing case studies. The business schools got all these case studies, and there's enough healthcare and biotech case studies in there that imagine if we got together, instead of just listening to lectures, we could really get elbow deep into the cases and even invite people that had lived those cases to come and teach us, right, in person. They're like, oh, we already have our budget fixed and we know what we're doing. We don't have, time or we can't make room for that. And so I had to start a student group in order to be able to pursue this idea. And I attracted a couple of fellow students, and we started it up. The Harvard Biotech Club is now 25 years old, and the HMSBA does not exist. So it was a really good example, I would say, of being entrepreneurial because you had to be, right? It's not like I wanted to start up a student group. That's a kind of an annoying, tedious exercise, really. Hopefully it's gotten easier over the years. But I couldn't work with an existing one. They wouldn't have me. So I had to start something new in order to pursue the idea I had. And that's kind of what entrepreneurialism should be. Don't start a company just because you want to run a company. Start a company because you have to in order to achieve what you want to achieve. So started up the Harvard Biotech Club. And use the opportunity to run all kinds of events and invite all kinds of speakers to learn. And that ended up being the foundation for what became my career.
Could you still recall what the Biotech Lab looked like in the first year?
Yeah, so I can tell you that I coded up the website myself. I had taken up a web development course in college, and I used those skills to build a website. I even remember how our co-founders, the co-founders were talking about what should we have as the form people should fill out to become members. And ultimately we decided just their email. That's it. We don't need to know their first or last name or anything about them, just their email. Let's make it as simple as possible. No requirement that it be a Harvard address, it can be anything. And I remember after a few years seeing resumes from people in I think there was a resume from the Philippines, and at the bottom it said member of the Harvard Biotech Club, right? The bar was that low that anybody in the world could just sign up and claim to be a member of so we were getting Harvard on people's resumes, who really didn't do much, to merit the Harvard name. But it was whatever we imagined, I remember when Kim, one of the co-founders, is like, we should start up our own blog, our own journal, online journal. And that night, we coded up a new page on the Harvard Biotech Club website, and we're debating the design and everything like that. And one of the first articles that we ended up posting was my interview of Bob Langer. Because we had a blog, I got to call up Dr. Bob Langer and ask him if I could interview him. So I got to meet him as a grad student. It's pretty cool, right? So you just have to have an excuse. And the Biotech Club gave us so many excuses to meet so many cool people.
Yeah, decades later, we're interviewing you right now from Biotech Club.
Yeah, I'm not Bob Langer, but you guys are working your way up to Bob.
Yeah, Bob Langer, next guest for the podcast. Confirmed here.
There you go.
I think that's when you talk about that. What's your proudest achievement from leading the newly established Biotech Club? You mentioned we get a lot of different audience and participants, but anything else? Yeah.
I mean, look, just this intro, right? Michelle pointed out that you guys have over 10,000 members. That's pretty incredible. I remember I think I started it in the middle of '99. And I remember how maybe within 6 months or so, we had 500 members. And I even remember a conversation that I had with a girl that I was dating who lived in another city, and it was long distance. And we would just chat, and I would be like, I just got crossed 500. I have 500 members of the Harvard Biotech Club. And she said to me, why would 500 people want to join your club? And I, thought like, oh, that doesn't feel very supportive, and it was probably the beginning of the end for us. But, I didn't think it was crazy that 500 people would want to, enter their email in a single field in a form just to hear about these events, because there weren't a lot of people doing what we were doing, right? And you could see it. There was a real hunger to learn more than what academic institutions were teaching people. We weren't the only ones. After all, there was the Harvard Medical School Business Association, and there were a few other clubs like that. But today, I mean, look what you guys have achieved, right? It's been 25 years. You've got over 10,000 members. You've got 20 different facets to what the club does. You've essentially spawned Nucleate, which, is basically the national, or is it global now, version of the Harvard Biotech Club, right? Harvard Biotech Club is arguably, the most successful biotech student organization on the planet. And so that's a lot to be proud of. Thank you for carrying that legacy. I certainly did not imagine this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's grown so much, and other universities have adopted as well, which I think is also important. You see how other people start copying you. It's clearly you have the good idea if other universities start doing that as well.
We actually created a package way back when. There was this programming language called Flash that could let you create dynamic things, and our logo, the Harvard Biotech logo, like when you load the page, it would roll into being. It was kind of a cool thing you can do. I don't know what you guys use now, but I'm pretty sure Flash doesn't exist. And we created a sort of set of templates for any student group that wanted to emulate us to be able to just use what we had. And I think Emory and a few other schools, they had logos that were kind of a play on ours, and it was the coolest compliment to see these, other groups spin up. It was like Fight Club. You start one, and then you see them popping up in other cities, but less cool than Fight Club.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could talk about the Biotech Club. It's not like Fight Club where you can't talk about it.
Yeah, you could talk about it.
So yeah, going along, you kind of talked a little bit about your interest in science and then kind of your entrepreneurship interest from your family. So not only did you start the Harvard Biotech Club, but after finishing your PhD, you went on to start the venture capital firm, RA Capital, right after grad school. So we kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about that, because not a lot of people can say they started a VC firm outside of the PhD. So it's very impressive. So how did you do that?
Luck. All right, you couldn't do this if you tried. So I wasn't trying to do that. I just wanted to learn, right? So my North Star was to learn how to be, a good executive so that someday I could be CEO of a company that launched a medicine, right? So how are you going to learn to be an effective executive of a good biotech company if you're coming out of grad school? Well, you might want to get a job that will teach you how to tell the difference between a well-run company and a poorly run company, right? Where could you learn to do that? Well, in the investing world, you've got all these analysts that are mentored up by experienced investors, and it's their job to hear tons of pitches, and I figure you do that for a few years, you'll learn to tell good from bad. Or at a larger company, there's business development analysts who have to evaluate all kinds of technologies and companies to figure out what should their companies be acquiring or which companies should they be partnering with. So that would be a cool way to learn, right? And there was a book called Alternative Careers for Scientists by Cynthia Robbins Roth that I read that just broke down, like, whatever you want to do in biotech, here's the path you might take as a graduate student. And if you want to be a VC, one of the suggestions was, well, you might want to get some experience working at your university's tech transfer office. If you want to go into business development, one of the things you might want to do is work in your university's tech transfer office. And as it happens, one of the, I think, founders or certainly presidents of the Harvard Medical School Business Association, HMSBA, that, forerunner to the Biotech Club, Ted Ashburn, who's a friend of mine today, he interned in the Beth Israel Technology Transfer Office. And I knew Ted back then, and I admired that, he had gone on to venture capital from there, and I just thought, like, I should just walk in his footsteps. And so how can I land an offer to intern or work in the Beth Israel Tech Transfer Office? So when I was starting up the Harvard Biotech Club, I reached out to Barry Eisenstein, who ran the Beth Israel Tech Transfer Office at the time, and I asked if he'd be the advisor, right? Everything is purposeful. There's a reason behind everything. It was to create optionality for the next step. And so he said yes, and that gave me an opportunity to get to know him. And then later, as I was graduating, he did give me an offer to join the Beth Israel Tech Transfer Office. I didn't take it. I didn't need it. I already had enough contacts in industry, but I had lined up the option in case I would need it, right? There was a plan. And I share this with you, because I know that one of the things you guys really want to do with this podcast is to give people really actionable advice, and I admire that. I think that's a really, really cool thing to think about, actionable advice people can use as they map out their own careers. And so for me, every step that I took was a way to increase my options, to make myself more marketable for the next thing I wanted to do. So the choice of advisor for the Biotech Club was meant to line me up with that option to go into tech transfer, which was meant to set me up with an option to go into venture capital or business development because of that book that I read. And those jobs were meant to train me in how to tell good companies from bad, hopefully pick up some good ideas and eventually join a good company. Right? You would not want to join a bad company and have it fail a couple of years later if you're trying to learn how to be an effective executive. Though failure teaches you a lot of lessons, it's not great to derail your career early with your company going out of business. So I was applying to exactly those kinds of jobs in venture capital and business development. And one of the people that I had met in the course of doing all the Biotech Club stuff was Richard Aldrich. And he was the chief business officer of Vertex Pharmaceuticals. And I really thought it was super cool to meet him. I met him because we had won an opportunity for some people in the Biotech Club to go to an investment bank conference that was in the Boston area. We said, hey, we'll send students, we'll work as like ushers or whatever it is that you need, but let us attend. And the bank was kind enough to say, sure, okay. And so I get to attend, a conference. Now I've gone to like hundreds of them. Like I'll do anything, not have to go to another one. But back then it was amazing to go as a grad student, to one of these conferences. And Richard Aldrich was speaking. Now, he was a storybook character for me in The $1 Billion Molecule, a book that was written about the founding of Vertex. And to meet a storybook character was super cool. So he gave his presentation about Vertex, and then he goes to a breakout room where investors that are interested in asking the executive, nitty-gritty questions, or, sit down with them and pepper them with questions. And it's investors, Rich Aldrich, and this, grad school kid. And, I sat there and I listened, and then afterwards, I hit him up with my business card, my Harvard Biotech Club business card. And he gives me his far more valuable Vertex card, right? As I think he was an autopilot, and I now know, that he already knew that he was going to be leaving Vertex, and this was like the last time that he would have to pitch, at a conference and put up with that whole rigmarole. But he gave me this card. And so, of course, what did I do with his precious contact information? I hit him up for a job in his business development group. And he emailed me back from a Yahoo email address. And he said, actually, I just left Vertex. I'm not the guy to talk to anymore. And he offered to connect me with the right person. But something I said or whatever, I pulled on that thread. I was curious, what was he going to do next with his career? And that conversation that we had by email, ended up with us getting a cup of coffee and him sort of kicking my tires and saying, I'm thinking of just going off on my own for a while, doing some consulting, investing some of my money in some private companies, maybe be an angel investor. I got an account with some cash and stocks in it, maybe trade some biotech stocks, help found some companies. I don't know. I could use some proactive, energetic, young scientist guy to do all this stuff with me. Would you like to work together? Pretty cool. Had I taken a job at Vertex, maybe I would have stood there in front of some room, for 30 minutes once a month, sweating as I pitched some idea or whatever, right? Hoping to get some time with the boss and learn something. Here, I got to share an office with, somebody who was very well regarded in the industry, very experienced. He had negotiated some of the industry's biggest deals. And what was really cool about Rich is that because he's not a scientist, he picked up an impressive amount of science along the way, but he was not the type to get lost in a data set. He would not give you grief over some imperfection in the control arm or a baseline imbalance. That he left to other people. But he would really cut to the heart of how is this going to make you money? Whatever you're talking about, do you have a line of sight to how this will ultimately drive profits? And that was helpful. That's what a young scientist actually needed to be asked. So I said yes. We started working together, sharing an office together, and I did not even at that point know that we were starting what would become RE Capital Management. It was called RE Capital Associates, and it was still just Rich's project. Within about 6 months, this was middle of 2001, within 6 months, he simplified my job. It wasn't consulting. He decided he didn't want to bother with that anymore. It wasn't investing in private companies. He basically said, this angel investing stuff's going to bankrupt me. It was a tough time in the market. We had the whole genomics bubble, and it was cratering at the end of 2001. And he said, I'm going to focus on getting involved with starting some companies, and I'll pull you in if I see anything interesting. But in the meantime, why don't you focus on that account of mine where I've got some cash in biotech stocks and figure out what I should be buying and selling. Something for which I was entirely unqualified, right? I was terrified of the financials. What do I know about reading the financial statements? He said, don't worry about it. All you got to know is how much cash they've got and how fast they're burning it and what they're going to achieve of any significance at all before they run out of money. And that latter part is all science. So that's your strong suit. It's one thing to be a newly minted PhD and maybe know how to read a cell paper. It's a whole other thing to analyze a company's science. So he was really expressing a lot of faith in me. And so I rewarded his faith in me by promptly losing a quarter of his money, down 25% in the first 6 months of the year 2002. That was kind of scary. But he said, well, you're beating the market. The market was down 45%. He was always willing to see the bright side of things. But why don't you try to find stocks that are going to go up now? And he was kind of right, because what I had focused on was how much cheaper certain companies were than they had been. Like, oh my God, Decode Genetics is sequencing everybody in Iceland. That's so cool. And they're cheaper than they were before. I think we'll buy some. That is not how you make money in anything. The question is, why should this stock go up? As soon as I reframed it that way, why would this go up? It changed my view of a lot of things. And I made back those losses by the end of the year. And in the next year, in 2003, I tripled his money and I caught the bug. And that's when I was like, you know what? Maybe I don't want to be CEO of a biotech company. Maybe I want to be an investor. And I would say I was very lucky and a little bit good back then. And then middle of 2004 is when I hired my now partner, Rajiv Shah. And the fact that Raj and I had to collaborate and share our diligence and write notes that we could understand, that was the beginning of what I would call RA Capital, the institution, right? It's one thing for one person to just pick stocks and make sense of them in their own head. And, I would have to sort of tell Rich why I liked the stock, but he basically never said no to anything. He just might ask me a few questions, but was like, well, if you believe in it, okay, go ahead. So he gave me a lot of rope. And that meant that my losses were my fault. My gains were to my credit. Like, I could really learn from, my judgments. And so when Raj joined, the fact that we now had to communicate and understand one another, take over for each other's diligence, develop a common language, build a research management system that could house all of our notes, I would say that moment that Raj and I started working together in the middle of 2004 and figured out how to collaborate, that was the true origin of RA Capital Management, which now has over 200 people who all have to communicate, collaborate, be on the same page as efficiently as possible. And you can go back and find the seeds of the kind of culture that allows us to function as one team, all the way back to middle of 2004 when Raj and I had to figure out how to work together.
It's a really cool story, kind of talking about, having the idea of where your journey's going to go, but pivoting, because you didn't really know you'd meet Rich and start a company with him, and then, switching careers as well. So it was a really cool anecdote. And I think you kind of touched a little bit upon switching from science to business. So I kind of want to hear a little bit more now. It's been over 20 years now. How do you kind of gain those leadership skills in terms of VC? Because you're coming out of grad school where, you have someone advising you. How did you go from, having an advisor to you're the boss and you're kind of like the one that's like leading this organization?
Yeah. They don't train you to manage people. They don't train you to mentor people. There's so much that grad school doesn't teach you to do. You just figure it out over time. I learned a lot of hard lessons. I learned that employees that you count on can decide that they're going to leave. So you learn to think about what is it that attracts somebody to a job, and you realize that every day that somebody comes into work is a day they are choosing you, right? There's no inertia. I mean, there's a little bit of inertia, but they're choosing you. You have to be the kind of place that they re-choose. It's not that different actually from investing in a stock. Some people get really caught up in the cost basis of a stock. I bought it at $10, it dropped down to $5. I'm going to hold it till it gets back up to 10, then I'm going to sell it because they don't want to lose money. But if their dog stepped on their keyboard and caused them to sell the stock at $5, and now they have, $5 in cash sitting there, you ask them, it's like, well, are you going to reinvest it and undo what your dog just did and buy that stock back? They're like, no, I'm not going to buy it at 5. There's other things that I think are better that are more likely to go up. Then it's like, so you're just attached to the cost basis, but all it would take for you to make a better investment decision is for your dog to dance across your keyboard. Do you need your dog to do that for you, or might you choose to sell that position and invest it in something better, right? And so every day you hold a stock is a day you're choosing to buy it, right? That's the lesson from that particular example. And the same goes for people, Every day they come into work is a day they're choosing to come into work. And so you become more mindful of the culture you're building, the opportunities that people have, in their job. And you learn to be really attentive and empathic to what everybody is trying to get out of a job opportunity. And so I think if you suffer all the lessons of not appreciating that, you will in time either fail at what you're trying to build, or you will develop the skills needed to become a CEO.
Yeah, I think you mentioned you're a virologist and also investor. The Gilead and its groundbreaking medicine, definitely, I think it's one for hepatitis C. Definitely, it's among the most successful investment for RA Capital. And could you please demystify how this investment decision was made? And also now you are like a biotech investment veteran. Would you like to share your philosophy for investing in a biotech company?
Wow, okay. So that's going to be near impossible to synthesize. I would tell you early on, probably one of my career-making investment decisions was actually towards the end of 2002. Remember, I told you I lost a quarter of Rich's money in the first 6 months of 2002. But then I made it back. And one of the two investments that I made that allowed me to make back those losses and end the year in slightly positive territory was investing in a company called Triangle Pharmaceuticals that was developing an HIV drug. And they were running a clinical study in South Africa. And the South African Ministry of Health declared that HIV does not cause AIDS and therefore terminated all trials in South Africa. And that caused Triangle Pharmaceutical stock to crater. Now, I did my PhD on HIV, so the one thing I definitely knew was HIV does cause AIDS. So I bought Triangle Pharmaceuticals, and soon thereafter, Gilead bought Triangle Pharmaceuticals, for a big premium, and Triangle's drug ended up being one of the two drugs that was in Gilead's blockbuster dual nuke. What did they call it? It was basically like the core platform on which all the HIV therapies were based. It was called Truvada, and so one of the two drugs in the dual nuke pair that was called Truvada was Triangle's drug. And so I remember that feeling of basically going against the entire market. Everybody seemed to be selling Triangle, which is not true. Technically speaking, anytime you see a stock go down and you see 1 million shares trade, that's not just 1 million shares sold, that's 1 million shares bought. But the bottom line is you can see that the market didn't believe in Triangle Pharmaceuticals. It was causing the valuation to drop. And here I was, some kid with no basis for beating the market, going against what everybody seemed to be expressing, buying that stock, and then I was right. I mean, the stock went up, I made money, I was right. That feeling of going against the entire market and realizing that you can be right and the rest of the market is wrong, it's an incredible feeling. And it makes you realize that you should get out there and do some more work, learn about another company and another one. Because even though lots of people have looked at it and they all have opinions and they are smarter than you and they're more experienced than you and whatever, doesn't mean they're right. They might be wrong, right? And there's that chance. And so that faith that you might be right and everybody else might be wrong, that's what drives you. Too many people believe that, what are the odds that I would be the one, to find it, right? Essentially, it's if there's a $100 bill lying on the sidewalk and people are walking past it because they basically say, what are the odds that I'd be the lucky one to just reach down and get a $100 bill? There must be a reason everybody's ignoring it. It must somehow be a trick, or it's fake, or it's dirty, or whatever. I too should walk by. But the bottom line is it's a $100 bill. Just reach down and pick it up. I mean, that's not everything's that easy, but there's an element of that, right? And if you don't try, if you don't take that chance and do the diligence to try to see where the market might be wrong, you'll certainly never find that undervalued stock. So I would tell you, you have to have the confidence to believe that you can do enough diligence to see where the market might be wrong. And then you need to apply a kind of a very disciplined approach to building a portfolio. When that stock goes up, ask yourself, would I be buying it at this price? If you bought it for $10 and you think it's worth 30 and it climbs to 25, would you be buying it at 25 if the upside is only to 30? Too often people say, but I believe the upside's to 30 and I bought it at 10, so I should hold to 30. But again, if your dog stepped on your keyboard and made you sell that stock and now you got $25 in cash, would you reinvest it in this company at 25? And if the answer is no, you might want to think about, proactively selling it rather than wait for your dog to, press the button, right? Those two things, that confidence that I could possibly find more stocks where the market was wrong, and that clarity of knowing that every day I hold a stock is a day I'm choosing to buy it. So if I wouldn't buy it, I shouldn't hold it. Those two things carried me for a decade. RA Capital was at first really just a hedge fund. Raj and I were just picking stocks. It wasn't until probably about 2009 or 10 that we invested in our first private companies, and not until really around 2012 that we started doing it with any kind of frequency, right? And didn't start taking board seats probably till 2013 or so. And takes you a few years of serving on boards, before you can say that you understand much at all about private companies and maybe can start thinking of yourself as a VC. So it was well over a decade before I would say I started to appreciate what VCs actually do. Get elbow deep into companies, invest in private companies, help steer them. Before that, it was a decade of being a public markets investor. It was a hedge fund, not a VC fund.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Peter. That's very good advice, career advice, especially to be confident in your intuition and your gut.
Oh, no, you're probably wrong. But the point is you might be right. Some people refuse to believe that they might be right. They believe that the world surely knows more than they do. But you gotta have some amount of confidence that there's a chance that you might be right.
Yeah, that's a good point. And going along the kind of career advice, we have a lot of people that are research assistants, computational associates, grad students, postdocs, industry scientists. So a lot of us are kind of thinking in terms of like career path, and with the current job market, which has been kind of struggling now for biotech. For instance, pharmaceutical companies are kind of shutting down drug development pipelines, laying off employees, and then VC companies, it's very competitive to get an internship or job at this point. So our next question is likely on the mind of our listeners, particularly grad students, for instance. Is breaking into VC kind of realistic at this point? And in general, do you have kind of advice for people trying to break VC into this economy or break into like the biotech economy overall at this point?
Yeah, so I would say that it's very difficult to become a good VC, and it's important to make distinctions between a public markets investor and a venture capital investor. It's very difficult to become a good VC because there's really two kinds of investors now. There used to be three. It used to be that you had public markets investors, you had VCs who invested in companies that were already formed. They just evaluated the opportunities they saw and they decided to invest or not. Call them somewhat later stage VCs. And then there were some VCs that formed companies from scratch. Very, very few of them. Now, if you think about it, could you train somebody straight up from grad school to be a company-forming VC? It's pretty tough, right? You should probably have actually done some of the work of running a company. You're basically an operator at that point, right? You're building companies out of nothing. But you could imagine how if you want to be a VC that just evaluates companies that are coming through for a Series B or a C or whatever, you might be trained to do that well, right? There's still some guiding of a company. You got to learn how to serve on boards. But there are people who, without any operating experience, came out of grad school, apprenticed long enough at an established VC firm, and today are partners of venture capital firms. And then public markets investing, it's a lot more, like you could come out of grad school, you could, train under people who know how to pick stocks. And if you happen to have the right aptitude for picking stocks, you could be promoted and eventually you can be an investor. Today, there's only two kinds of investors, I believe. There are investors that are focused on companies that are already in existence, but they tend to be more fluid about whether they're public or private. There's some investors that are just pure public markets, but for the most part in biotech, if you're interested in biotech specifically, I would call that crossover investors. They can invest in a crossover round, Series B or whatever of a company, and then in the IPO, and then in subsequent follow-on financings. And then there are the investors that form companies. And so I don't think there are any funds that I'm aware of that would be considered straight VC funds today that only invest in existing companies, other people's companies. You think about some of the great funds that are out there, like, Atlas. They form their own companies. They used to invest in other people's companies, but really they pivoted years ago to forming their own companies. And so you'd have to interview them, interview Bruce or Jean-Francois, and find out like what kind of folks they hire. But I would imagine that at this point, you're more likely to hire in venture partners or entrepreneurs in residence, executives in residence, people who can help you build these companies. And the investors who evaluate existing companies, and just judge them, are they good or not, they might hire somebody straight out of school, right? They may still call themselves VCs, but there's also some, you have to kind of understand how to trade stocks. You have to understand, like, IPOs are no longer an exit. Now, I'm talking to you guys as if, like, you come from 20 years ago. In theory, those of you that have studied this space more recently, you're like, why are you teaching me something I already know? Of course I know that there's no such thing as VC that only focuses on existing private companies and just sells a company's stock once it goes public. But the word VC has morphed over time. And the word VC today, I'd say, probably applies more to company formation, and you need to think about the other kind of investors as really just judgers of companies. And if you're a judger of companies, you'd better be prepared to judge public and private companies. You'd better be prepared to see your companies through an IPO. IPO is not an exit. You're going to be managing public positions. You'd better learn how stocks trade, and when to sell in the public markets, when to buy more, right? So it's a different skill set. And so I would not recommend that anybody aspire to become what today counts as a VC, a company former coming straight out of grad school. You've got no basis for, being good at that. You'd better apprentice. You'd better go join a company. You'd better learn something about how companies work, and then you might be able to, come to a company formation fund and say, here's my executive experience. I can help you build companies. So if you want to become an investor, you're really thinking about becoming an investor at a crossover type fund. Maybe it's a hedge fund, maybe it's a mutual fund. Even mutual funds will do crossover investing,
Thanks so much for the advice and kind of giving like the different paths, going from you could be a starter, create something, or go to an existing company and kind of learn from people that have that experience and, maybe getting to a point where you could start something. So I think it was very helpful for all of us to hear.
Yeah. So RA Capital, as we know, is just also established entrepreneurship initiative called Raven, right? And
an incubator.
So you just mentioned that the VC, enter VC now is need like a more like experience for executive or like operating. And do you think that any suggestion for students and trainees who want to start about a company, given the current economy? Do you think it's a good time? And any suggestion for them?
Yeah, so Raven, which is just short for RA Ventures, it's a portfolio company of ours that really serves as a an incubator, a platform that allows us to start up companies, but also provide services to all of our portfolio companies. So we've got a lot of people in the Raven incubator at this point. And that represented our final sort of evolution from being a public-focused hedge fund to then a crossover fund that could invest in existing private companies and take them public, to then being able to start up our own companies, and go all the way to the origin point, right? And the kinds of people that like starting companies, they also tend to like getting equity in companies. And so, the people in RA Capital proper, we don't get any equity in the companies. We get compensated only from the profits that we get from our fees as investors. But it's not easy to attract company builders if you say, yeah, you're not going to get any stock in the companies you form, like they want to, right? So you have to create this sandbox that allows them to be adjacent to the investment firm and able to work on company creation. If they create something that they really like and they want to go off with it and they want to serve as an executive or a board member, then they can stay with their project. Now, Raven is it's a place where we try to attract people with a wide diversity of skills. We see the entire process that companies are going to have to go through in order to ultimately create a medicine or whatever the business that we're building. So you've got people who specialize in drug discovery, in screening assays, in GLP studies in order to ultimately, get a candidate to an IND. We've got regulatory expertise. We have people who specialize in manufacturing. These are all the kinds of skills, that you would want if you were building a business, right? If you're a scientist with an idea, I think a molecule like this might be able to cure this disease, you're going to have to figure out how to solve all these things, right? And so by creating this sandbox that has all this kind of expertise in it, what we have attempted to do is to create the kind of place that, that innovator, that scientist with an idea would want to come to and say, can I build my company with you, right? Ultimately, RA Capital, as a source of funding, we are in the business of identifying great companies and trying to invest money into those companies. Those are two steps. You can identify a company, but that company won't let you invest in them. Then there's absolutely no utility to identifying them. You have to get the board, the CEO, the management team to say, we want your money. When the markets are really beaten down and very few people are investing, that's probably easier. If you're offering money, there's a chance you're the only one offering money, so I guess they'll take it. But you don't just want to invest in companies where you're the only one who likes them and nobody else wants to invest. You got to be prepared that when somebody has got something really compelling, lots of investors want to invest. And so you got to ask yourself, why would people want to take your money? Right? And that's what makes you start thinking, not as just some investor who yells, buy, sell, whatever you've seen on TV of investors. Like, that's not biotech investing. You really start thinking about, how can I give the companies that I'm investing in so much more than money, right? And as you think about their needs, you think about, the intellectual capital that would benefit them, the human capital, the services, the additional, help that you can offer them. And so ultimately, RA Capital has grown simply because of that observation that if we want to win the privilege to invest in great companies, we'd better have way more than just money to offer, because everybody's got money. The world is awash in money. And so venture capital, I would argue, has evolved to be what it claimed to be. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was in grad school and I was learning about venture capital, they would say, we offer more than money. We offer our expertise and real help. Like, we'll get elbow deep into what you're doing and really help you. It wasn't really all that true. That's one of the things that we learned along the way. That's something they say. But today, I would say that RA Capital and some other institutions have really invested in building up, their toolkits, and they can help companies grow, right? And so that's the real arms race. That's what competition has elicited from the investor class, to be more than just money allocators, to really be partners that are helping solve all these problems, like how do you enroll clinical trials faster? Little companies can't afford all of the expertise that it takes to build out their AI capabilities, right? AI is not yet at the point where anybody can spin up a Google sheet, right? Spreadsheets, not a competitive advantage anymore. AI is. So having AI expertise at your firm and be able to help a company set up their learning engine if they're trying to build a more efficient drug discovery platform, that is helpful, right? And so as you're studying what it is that really great innovators need, and you keep hearing like, I need help with this, I need help with that, you think, how do I build a tool that will do that at scale, right? And so if you look at RA Capital, if you come to our website and you see things like the Gateway website that we built, or you see the Sabre deck that teaches how to construct a board deck for board meetings, the Series I slides on how to take a company public, these are all things we created in response to seeing the same pain points over and over and over again amongst our companies and trying to think, how do we systematically resolve those pain points for people, right? And we've got over 200 portfolio companies at this point, right? Like some of them are just tiny little seeds that we planted, but that's an awful lot of learning about common problems.
And you actually mentioned multiple times luck. And I think could you actually I also, we found in the blue sky, you actually mentioned created luck and by doing things out of class. And I think it's very interesting for more our listener and trainee and next generation biotech people. Could you tell me little about, share more about luck?
Yeah, so I posted this career advice thread on Blue Sky, and you can find it now. I just re-Blue Skyed it. What do you say, retweet or something on? I don't actually know the terminology for Blue Sky, but repost. Yeah, thank you. And the first suggestion is create your own luck by doing things other than what school makes you do, right? So you're in grad school, you go to classes, you go to your lab, you do your research, you publish your papers. That's not going to get you lucky. I mean, if you want to be a scientist and your research works out well and you get some Cell and Nature papers, that certainly is great, and it'll advance your scientific career. But if you're trying to break into the business world, you've got to create your own luck somehow. Now, for me, that was the Harvard Biotech Club, creating a student group that gave me the excuse to invite lots of people to speak and take them out to dinner and get to know them, and ultimately get into a conference and meet Rich Aldrich and get his business card, et cetera, right? Like, that's creating your own luck. And so I would encourage anybody who's wondering, how can I, pursue a career? How do I get noticed? How can I someday send an email or, a LinkedIn post or whatever to somebody who runs a company, and I want a job there, and get them to take interest in me? You got to do something to be different, to stand out, to have something unique to say. And so if you read that thread, you'll see I say get involved in a student group, start one, or join one and start some project, like you guys have started this podcast series, and then see that thing through to completion. And if whatever that first idea is that you start out trying, if that's not the right one, fine. Preserve your time, pick something else, but see something through to completion, because ultimately, when you try to reach out to somebody to get noticed, you're going to want to very clearly signal to them, I can get things done. I can come up with a new idea. I can figure out how to, I can plan it. I can execute on it. I can learn what works, what doesn't work, and pivot as needed. And ultimately, I can see it through to completion. I am one of those people that gets stuff done. There's an awful lot of people that are keen to be told what to do. They have their role. If they can do that well, they certainly have that role. But in the field of entrepreneurship or investing or whatever, what you're really looking for are people who can diagnose opportunities themselves, come up with a plan and act on them and see them through. They've got the grit to persevere. So anything you can do to be able to show that you have it. Don't tell, right? Don't write something that says, I'm a very curious person and I'm also determined and I get stuff. Like, that doesn't mean anything. You show it by describing something that you did, right? So for me, it was I started the Harvard Biotech Club, and I tried to start up a biotech company myself while in grad school, but I quickly realized how terrible I was at it. But I took my lessons and I researched how to start up a biotech company. I wrote a book, The Entrepreneur's Guide to a Biotech Startup, and I saw that through and I published it. It's online. Like, okay, not everybody does that. All right, you stand out. And so Rich wanted to have a coffee with me because of that. And he told me, he's like, you're proactive. I don't feel like I'm going to have to manage you, diligently. I'll just point you in a direction. I feel like you'll probably figure it out. That's what he valued because, he wanted to have his time. He didn't want to spend all his time managing me. So there's a lot of people like that who, want people who are going to be catalysts for them. They put 1 hour of management into them and they get 40 hours of productivity. Put in another hour of guidance and 40 more hours of productivity. Show that that's going to be you, right? And I think student groups are a great opportunity to show off your entrepreneurial chops or gain some. Show that you can build a team to execute on something. Not easy. Students are really busy. You just try and, rally a bunch of students to all work on one project voluntarily. It is really, really hard. You're not paying anybody anything, right? So it's pure volunteerism. But if you can do it and you can speak to what you accomplished, that'll help you stand out. There's a few other tips in there you guys can find.
Cool. Thank you for that, Peter. And me and Feng would be very remiss if we didn't ask you about a topic you're very passionate about, and that's drug pricing. So as some people know, Peter has written the Great American Drug Deal, which he goes into this concept of the biotech social contract, where biotech companies as well as healthcare has kind of a role in terms of this social contract in terms of making innovative drugs, but also affordable drugs for patients. And you kind of talk a little bit about why drugs in America are more expensive compared to other countries. So could you talk a little bit about this biotech social contract and how, that kind of necessitates potentially why there's this difference and what are kind of solutions to kind of alleviate this issue since the system's flawed?
So firstly, I'd invite anybody to go to nopatientleftbehind.org. That has certainly been a real passion of mine, both helping to launch that organization and populating its website with a lot of content. I think that we do have a problem in our industry that a lot of the people that have learned science and that engage in the scientific process, they have not been given the information, the framework for understanding why they shouldn't hate pharma like everyone else in America does. Like, you want to do your science, you want to do your experiments, you believe you're doing good, but then you see like how patients can't afford, medicines, and you hear how pharma raises prices and all that kind of stuff, and you're like, God, am I working for, evil companies? And the reality is that America has really misunderstood how it is that we both create new drugs and make them affordable. And if we don't, first of all, teach it to our own people so that they grow up, within their industry proud of what they're doing, we definitely are not going to be able to teach it to the whole country. So I think that it should really be part of, every, biology, training course, whether it's in college or, grad school or medical school, to understand, how is it that, like, these medicines are good, but patients not being able to afford them sounds terrible. And the answer is the role of insurance, right? Nothing in this country is affordable, nothing healthcare anyway related, and many other things aren't affordable without something akin to insurance. For example, could families protect their own houses from burning down on their own? Could you like own your own fire truck and have access to tons of water, so you could put it out? No. So what do towns do? They ultimately have an insurance scheme. They, tax everybody, they pool it in a fire department, they buy some fire trucks, and the whole town feels safer. Now, a few homes burn, the fire truck shows up, puts them out, and, those families definitely benefit. But I think everybody in that town benefits from the fact that, they pay for that, right? It gives them peace of mind to know, like, oh, wow, the neighbor's house was saved. Someday maybe that's my house, right? Does the fire truck, do the firefighters roll up and charge you a high co-payment, that maybe 8 out of 10 families can afford, but 2 of them can't, and so the firefighters just stand there and let the home burn? No. But we have hundreds of millions of Americans who pay insurance premiums every year, and when they get cancer, most of them can afford the co-payments that they need for the drugs, but some of them can't. And all of a sudden, people start asking, well, why does a fire truck cost so much? Right? Nobody cares what a fire truck costs, because in your moment of greatest anguish, it's not an issue. The fire truck just rolls up and they save your house and they save your lives, right? But because some people can't afford the equivalent of the fire department rolling up and saving them from their cancer, which may as well be your body, your family on fire, people are angry. And as they cast about looking for somebody to blame, some people correctly point out, hey, I've paid my insurance premiums my whole life, and I feel like you're not honoring your promise to make appropriate treatments affordable to me. So they correctly direct their attention, their complaints to insurance design. But some people, well, it's not something they've been trained to understand. They don't have to understand. It just feels like, well, why does this medicine cost so much? Like, they see the cost of the medicine. It's right there in the invoice that they see at the pharmacy, and so they get angry at innovators. And members of Congress then say, oh, would you like me to take care of that? I'll just price control that. And, oh, by the way, I'm sure you don't have to worry about innovation. I'm sure they'll keep innovating, right? And so people say, yeah, I'd like that, please. And so because some people can't afford the medicines that they need, which is a function of the insurance design in this country, we have a lot of anger, and some of it is misdirected at the innovators. And the proposed solution, while some people propose insurance reform and capping out-of-pocket costs and making sure that insurance honors its promise, other people propose, well, how about we price control those bastards? And that sounds good to a lot of voters. Sounds, like, doesn't the NIH invent medicines? And aren't those medicines cheaper in Canada? So yeah, we should just be able to, pay as little as Canada does. I'm sure that's fine. And, they haven't studied economics or whatever, and they shouldn't have to. They should just be able to count on getting those medicines after years of paying their insurance premiums. And ideally, our policymakers would not cynically buy their votes by offering them a solution that will merely hurt everybody, right? So if you ultimately price control a medicine that costs, let's say, $100,000, and you make it cost as little as maybe Canada pays, let's say Canada pays $30,000. If someone can't afford their $5,000 deductible, are they going to be able to afford the medicine, whether it's $100,000 or $30,000? No, because they still have to pay $5,000. Right? So the idea that price controls will make medicines affordable is itself false. What price controls will do is it will allow the entire healthcare system, which is mostly paid for through our premiums, to pay less for drugs. But the co-payments, whatever the out-of-pocket costs are for patients, will be whatever they are. In fact, if you guys have read about how even generic drugs have been marked up by insurance, by PBMs, and that Mark Cuban sells them for a lot less, like he sells them for cash, like a medicine that your PBM charges you $500 for, he sells it for like $20. And you're like, wait, how could that be? Well, that shows you how decoupled your costs are through insurance from what a drug company actually charges. Insurance can make anything affordable or unaffordable. They can layer on a ton of fees on top of it, or they can pay the full cost of the drug. Affordability is purely a function of insurance. What we are spending as a society on medicines, well, that is a function of what the drug industry charges, sure. But consider that we can invent a medicine that is functionally a cure for a disease, and it will be expensive for the life of that patent, and then it'll go generic and it'll be cheap forever. Or if we don't invent that, we will be paying for the cost of hospitals and clinics and doctors forever. Hospitals and clinics and doctors do not go generic. And so as you look at what it is that you might be able to achieve as scientists, like if you have an idea and you think like, oh, someday maybe this could be a medicine, the launch of that medicine is not actually your true legacy. That's a milestone along the way. That's a remarkable accomplishment. And if indeed many patients end up wanting it, if it's good enough to be baked into standard of care and it really helps people, you should be very proud. But when that medicine finally goes generic, off patent, and drops in price, that is your true legacy, because you have created a public good that will forever leave that disease better managed forever. You have dented the universe forever, at least for humans. So that is your true legacy. Now, our industry has something to offer in exchange for insurance reform. Not all that we do is, a good thing, because what we have started to do, since sometime in the 90s in particular, and then really growing over time, is milk biologic products, which don't abide by the same rules of going generic that small molecules do. Milk those drugs for profits long after their patents have expired. Because biologics are hard to copy. It's hard to get one biologic to be equivalent to another and for a pharmacy to just swap it out. And that means that if you invent, especially something like a gene therapy, if you think about it, like there's a window in time. That baby has to get that gene therapy right there at 4 months. What mother would ever enroll her baby in a clinical trial that says, well, we'll randomize you either to Zolgensma, the proven drug that is approved, or to a biosimilar gene therapy that aspires to, at best, be as good as Zolgensma, but might not be? No mother would enroll her baby in that, because if it turns out that biosimilar gene therapy is not good enough, that baby can't get Zolgensma as a rescue therapy. They've developed antibodies, it won't work for them. Right? That's an undoable trial. And therefore, as long as we have a requirement that a biosimilar shows some clinical data showing comparable activity and safety to the original drug, you will never be able to get a copy of that drug that is now substitutable. So what you have there is a natural monopoly. Patents are a form of monopoly that society grants to innovators in order to allow them to profit from their invention, but for a temporary time so that they invent, so that investors take a risk on them and help invent that thing so that eventually when the patent expires, it's a public good. It becomes easy to copy. But natural monopolies are actually anti-competitive. They're anti what capitalism wants to see. A natural monopoly is something that needs to be regulated. For example, the water management system here in Boston. It would not be very effective to say, let's have 5 companies build parallel pipes to every building, and then customers can play them off one another and make sure that the price is nice and low. So instead, you contract with one company, and you give them that monopoly on all of Boston or all of Cambridge, but it's a regulated monopoly. And so this is the one area where our industry had something legit to give. I would say that Congress, when it was drafting its law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, they were willing to reduce out-of-pocket costs for patients, improve insurance, but they were searching for a pound of flesh to take from the drug industry. And because they weren't guided to the legit tumor that we had growing in us, which is rent-seeking, which is milking these, biologic drugs for profits long after their patents expired, Congress took a more vital organ. They took a chunk of our liver out of us. Right? They ended up imposing price controls on not just biologics at 13 years, which is close enough to where the patent system would have intended for them to go generic. The average period of time before a drug goes generic is about 14 years. So now there's a price control of biologics at 13 years. All right, a little 1 year faster than should have been. But for small molecules, they said we're going to price control small molecules 9 years after they launch, shaving off from 14 down to 9, that time on the market, that's worth about half of the entire value of a small molecule drug. So they've cut the value of inventing a small molecule drug roughly by half for a disease of aging, because this is only something that applies to Medicare and Medicaid. And so why did they do that? Why did they, instead of just imposing this fail-safe and say, hey, if your drug hasn't gone generic by the time that the patent system intended for it to go generic, after about 14 years, then we'll squash its price. Why did they, price control small molecules down at 9 years? And it's because they weren't thoughtful about it. There were people in the government that said, let's just price control drugs as soon as they launch. That's it. You get FDA approval instantly. We'll just tell you what you're allowed to charge. And then there were other people that said, that's wrong, that would kill innovation. And there was a fight. It wasn't a bunch of rational people sitting down trying to get to the right answer. It was a fight between those that would gladly have imposed price controls at launch and those that were trying to preserve the incentives for innovation. And for the most part, biologics landed at a reasonable point and small molecules didn't. And it shows you what happens when we have people who cynically are willing to pass any policy that it takes to win American voters over, right? Some of them knew better. They knew what was going to happen. They're like, the American public wants to punch pharma in the face, and we're going to do it for them. So at the end of the day, we all have to defend what we love. If you love doing research, if you love the idea of someday contributing to launching a medicine, then at your family dinners, when some member of your family says, yeah, but doesn't pharma like price gouge or whatever, you got to be able to explain to a member of your family.
We definitely experienced that.
Yeah, right. You got to practice. And then you got to figure out how you're going to teach it to others. You got to figure out how everybody at Harvard, college students that are studying political science, people who go to the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard Law School, everybody has to ultimately come away with an appreciation that what we are collectively on is a grand quest. It's not so different from the quest to put astronauts on the moon or the quest to go to Mars, except I can tell you, when we have vanquished a cancer, that is a heck of a lot more useful than putting boots on Mars. I do not understand how anybody on Earth will benefit from a colony on Mars. It's super cool. Don't get me wrong. It's really exciting, and I love that some of my taxes are going to fund NASA, and I enjoy watching, SpaceX rockets, go up and all that. But there's a similar story to tell about all of these clinical studies and experiments trying to chip away at cancer. Each one of these studies is like a rocket launch. And when it works, that is progress. And America should be watching these quests, and they should be saying, oh, when one of those rockets blows up and one of those trials fails, right? But we don't do that as an industry, do we? We, do all of our experiments, in secret. Sure, all of us nerds are into it, and we track this stuff. But mostly, you don't see industry promoting, ongoing trials and, hey, what if it works? You do all this stuff in secret, and then only when something works, we put money behind it, direct-to-consumer advertising to raise awareness of the fact that now this medicine exists, and that's a beneficial awareness campaign. But it kind of makes it sound like all pharma does is succeed. Like we just keep getting new drugs, right? Nobody has a stake in the quest. Nobody ultimately roots for a trial to work and then experiences what it's like to see it fail, right? You ultimately have to show people the whole struggle. The NFL does not play its games in secret and then spend its marketing dollars on, this team won, the Cowboys won. People would be like, who are the Cowboys and who cares, right? No, they bring you into the game and they tell you about the players. They, get you attached to the backstories of the players and the teams. And when you watch your team lose, it makes it so much more powerful when your team wins. And look at the dollars that America puts into both the NFL and into NASA. And it is only 8% of all the premiums that Americans pay every month for all of health insurance. Of all our healthcare dollars, only 8 cents on the dollar goes towards novel medicines. And it is that 8 cents that drives all forward progress. What little America spends on novel medicines is the incentive for all the innovation that goes on. A cumulative like $270, $280 billion a year of R&D in total. By the way, that's a much bigger number than you hear about when people only focus on pharma. They're like, oh, pharma only spends this much on R&D, which is like Taylor Swift and Beyonce only spend this much of their time on writing songs. You can't just focus on the stars. You have to focus on everybody else. And there are tons of companies that are not as successful as Pfizer and Merck and others that are only doing R&D. They have no revenue. And so when you add up all the companies, what you realize is we spend a massive amount of the profits that are earned from today's drugs on R&D to invent tomorrow's. We are a very optimistic industry. We are reinvesting today's profits into medicines for tomorrow. America's got to be brought in on that quest in order to get them jazzed about what's coming and to be proud of the role they're playing by paying their insurance premiums. And many of them don't even realize that they're invested in biotech. If you've saved up for your pension, your pension fund's probably invested some little sliver of it in biotech. And so they're investing in biotech hoping that these companies will be profitable, right? I mean, nobody invests in a company that they will give away its products for free. So they're hoping that whatever biotech companies they may be invested in, even if it's subconsciously hoping, that they're profitable. Profitable doesn't mean unaffordable. Thanks to insurance, and insurance is possible because everyone pays into it. So all Americans that either invest, or certainly pay premiums, which is to say almost all Americans, have a role in this grand quest to vanquish diseases. And this is not a story that our industry has told. This is a story that I hope you all tell at your Thanksgiving dinner table, right? And I hope that you find some way to spread the word to all of your peers, especially those that go into journalism or that may end up working as a healthcare staffer for a congressperson or senator, right? Because we ultimately need people in those positions to tell these stories, understand these stories in the right way. Otherwise, you're going to get them pandering to angry Americans, basically cutting America's nose off to spite, Europe's face, right? Like this is essentially what's happening, where people are so angry that other countries get to pay less for medicines that they're saying, that's it, we're not going to pay any more than Europeans or Canadians pay. Well, other countries are free riding on America, and if you pay as little as free riders do, all you'll end up doing is depriving yourself of innovation, right? And that would be unfortunate. But that's what anger does. That's what people who just want to see fairness and without thinking it through, they might make that kind of a mistake and ultimately hurt themselves.
I think drug pricing is always like provocative topic in the United States, and with public anger over the high drug prices and the broken health care insurance system behind them. Actually, in your book, The Great American Drug Deal in 2016, and you described the U.S. healthcare insurance system as Byzantine system. And in 2020, you were on Luke Timmerman's long-run podcast episode called Soul of Pharma. You spoke out again for healthcare insurance reform. Since then, could you reflect if the situation has been getting better or getting worse?
Yeah, so what I've come to appreciate, is that every generation, every decade, this idea that the drug industry, or actually many industries, are profiteering, that the government has to step in and control prices, these ideas keep coming up. Broadly, these ideas that the government can protect consumers from evil companies, I would lump that under a theme called central planning. Just trust us. Put your faith in us, the government. We will run formulas that determine what the price of everything should be. This idea is a really dangerous, insidious idea, because anybody who's ever looked at any formulas that supposedly calculate the value of anything would see that they're deeply flawed and very oversimplified. Anytime we've ever had rent-controlled housing that made it cheaper for the people who happen to have those apartments, but then there's no new houses built in those neighborhoods, no new apartments built, and you get a housing crisis. The most expensive home is the home that doesn't exist. The most expensive drug is the drug that doesn't exist. There's literally no amount of money that you can pay to get that cure because it doesn't exist, right? Now, you don't feel like you're being price gouged because you simply accept, well, I guess the medicine doesn't exist. But imagine if any of you, as you were thinking about what career to pursue, if you saw a bunch of careers where you could see what kinds of lifestyles people are living who have gone into, computer engineering or into law or into medicine or whatever, and then there's a career, where somebody says, we won't tell you how much you're going to make until after you have graduated with a diploma in that field, whatever it is, I don't know, psychology. Like, we won't tell you. Who would go into that? Nobody would, right? But essentially that's what a price control is. First you invent it, then we'll tell you what we'll pay. You would say, well, can you tell me how much I'm going to make? Right? Like the US military, for example, will say, if you enroll in the military, here's what you will make. So, it's not a free market. You don't get to shop yourself around. It's like, well, the Navy or the Marines or whatever, there are pay scales. But you know it ahead of time, right? And so you can plan accordingly. And so it's possible to have something like a forward contract where the government says, we really need pandemic flu vaccines. We promise we will pay whatever, $50 a dose, and we will buy a certain number of doses, like 100 million doses, if you make it. Okay, now that I have that certainty, I can invest in it. But nobody would ever say, oh, I'll just invent that, and then let the government determine how much to pay, especially not when it's a government that hates you, that loves pandering to the American public and saying, yeah, the NIH invents everything, and those guys do nothing, right? They're going to take whatever you invented and basically pay you only the cost that it takes to produce those doses. So you'll get $2, per dose. And so no investor will give you the money to create those pandemic flu vaccines or whatever, if it's going to only be, you'll only find out what you can make after you've invented it. So every generation, somebody has to rise up and respond to these proposals of, hey, we're the government, we'll just set prices better than the market does, and explain what a market is. And every generation needs people that will stand there and defend capitalism. I mean, I didn't think I'd be doing it. But what I'm defending is the ecosystem that I understand. I know what it takes for me to be able to retain the money that has been entrusted to my team. I know that if we don't generate a return for our investors, people who are basically giving us their pensions, or universities are giving us their endowments because they hope to be able to offer more scholarships as well as look after the retirement of their faculty, if we don't generate a good enough return, they'll just take that money away. If RA Capital gets less money, and if that money doesn't flow to some other biotech fund, then biotech has less money, right? So I have to make sure that we generate an attractive enough return that our investors want to keep investing. And therefore, I need the underlying companies that I put that money into to ultimately try to be profitable if they're lucky enough even to get a drug on the market. I want them to be as efficient as possible at developing their drug. I don't want them wasting money on bad projects. I don't want them wasting money on clinical trials they don't need to be doing. I'm trying to help them be as efficient as possible. And at the same time, I want them, if they do get a drug on the market, I want them to be profitable. And since most of our investments fail, I need the few that succeed to be really profitable. Not just to justify the investment that went into them, but to ultimately keep my whole portfolio in the black. So if a company says to me, and this did happen, a company came and said, we want to be good guys. We're not going to charge a very high list price. We're just going to charge a low list price, but then we won't give any rebates to PBMs. No discounts. It'll just be a nice low price. We don't want to get a bad reputation. And I said to him, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to charge a high list price so that you've got room in your price to offer a big fat rebate to PBMs, because otherwise they won't cover you. They need to be seen as a hero that extracted a big rebate. You got to act like the bad guy so that they can say, well, I'm the good guy, and I continue to win contracts from insurance companies, right? Because insurance companies are the ones that contract with PBMs to decide how much to pay for which drugs, right? It's a subcontractor for insurance companies to just handle the drug formulary. And this team at first really opposed it. Like, we don't want the bad press of coming out with a high drug price. And I'm like, I'm sorry. Like, look, I wrote a book. There's even a chapter that describes PBMs as false heroes. And if they're false heroes, then you've got to be a false villain, right? And they consulted some other board members and everything, and ultimately grudgingly said, you're right. And they had to launch their drug with a high list price. And they offered rebates to PBMs, but they're getting covered. And so what's more important? Looking like you're a good guy because you came up with a low price, but you're not covered, or securing coverage? Because patients aren't going to get that drug if it's not covered by insurance. And so they had to do this thing they didn't want to do. They had to be the bad guy so PBMs could be the good guy, but what matters is patients are able to get that medicine. So if you understand how the system works, then you end up doing things that maybe you don't want to do, but if you can explain it to your grandmother, so that she realizes that you're not a bad guy, it makes your life a bit easier, right? And so my hope is that everybody can learn these things that aren't taught in, medical school or, in any kind of scientific program. They're maybe taught in schools of economics, but very few of us double major in economics. I'll give you an example. Most people think that nonprofits are somehow better and more moral than for-profits. That somehow they're not conflicted. They don't have to answer to shareholders. But how is it possible that we have a system where the cost at a for-profit hospital can be the same as the cost in a nonprofit hospital? I mean, if the nonprofit is cheaper, how come the nonprofit isn't getting all the work? And the answer is that at the end of the day, there's, what we call for-profit is just the portion of revenues that goes to shareholders, investors, people who helped start that business, own a piece of that business, but aren't actually employees. Whereas a nonprofit, you can think of it as a company that is completely owned by its employees. And that nonprofit can charge just the same high prices. It can generate tons of quote-unquote profit, but as long as that profit is paid out to all current employees or spent on a marble lobby or whatever, then, it all costs the same. They're enriching themselves just the same way. They can be just as eager to make more money as anybody else. So don't fall for it. Don't fall for the idea that somehow profit is this thing that makes an entity more corrupt or whatever. How about a surgeon? Have you considered a surgeon who makes $800,000 a year? None of that is called profit. But if you don't think that some portion of $800,000 a year is that person's personal profit compared to someone else who makes a lot less money, then you don't really understand what profit is at its root essence. So a business that is very profitable is able to deliver something that people value highly, but is making it for a small cost. That's actually really awesome. It means it's a very desirable product, and it is possible to make it for cheap. The signal of that profitability attracts others to jump in and say, let me take a crack at that. I want to make a product like that too, and I should be able to win some market share if I charge a bit less. Competition is what ultimately reduces the price. And of course, if somebody comes up with a better product and people are willing to pay even more for it, then they become much more wildly profitable, right? And so at the end of the day, what really drives people to do good for society is if society forces them to compete to provide what society wants, right? Whatever it is that society wants, it has these rules that it can set up to make people hustle, compete, try as hard as they can. But whether they're profit or non-profit has nothing to do with it, right? How do we get people to see past words like that to the underlying principles at work so that they don't get fooled by something like, well, we are virtuous because we are nonprofits? Don't ever let somebody bamboozle you into thinking that they're more virtuous because they're a nonprofit. They're pulling one over on you, right? They may be delivering nothing of much value while paying themselves plenty. So you got to learn how to do your diligence and parse these things and get down to, the first principles.
Yeah, I think we already have the answer for actually our next question, your motivation to establish no patient left behind.
Yeah, you spend your time trying to teach concepts like insurance is the root of affordability and drugs going generic is how society, gets value for medicines. And you could put that in a book, but let's face it, not many people read books. So if you really want to achieve change, you'd better figure out how to, actually become an advocate, right? And a organization like No Patient Left Behind is a platform for continued advocacy, right? And when you're invited by students to come do a podcast, and among the things you're going to talk about is drug pricing, you say yes, right? In the hopes that maybe it reaches a few thousand people, and maybe it sets a whole generation of scientists, and maybe some others, on a slightly different career path. One where they'll not only invent things, but they will also talk about the importance of insurance, and they will speak up publicly, and someday maybe write letters to senators, and just nudge America towards better policy, right? If price controls pass the way that the last administration would have liked to pass them, right, if not held off by defenders of innovation, if they had passed price controls on all medicines at launch, odds are most of you would have very different careers to look forward to. There'd be no money in development of new drugs, none. And you even have to wonder, would America appreciate the NIH and all the basic science that it does if no one will then take those ideas and convert them into medicines? If $280 billion of industry R&D were to go away because what's the point? The government's just going to price control whatever you develop successfully. Then what's the point of the, like $80 billion or something like that of NIH funding? I mean, it just becomes a tease. It's like, I think I found a new mutation that might explain how we could cure this cancer. Doesn't matter. No one's going to invest in the actual development of a drug to exploit that insight, right? And so may as well just cut NIH funding too. And, how many people appreciate that of that $280 billion that's spent on R&D, how much of it goes towards clinical trials, which means how much of it goes to MGH, Brigham, right, for all the clinical trials that they conduct, how much of their budgets are supported by all the R&D dollars that industry spends. And those R&D dollars are only possible because of drug costs. So how much of our hospitals are funded because R&D is so expensive? I mean, it costs, one of my companies is working on autoimmune diseases, and they estimated that it's costing them $400,000 right now per patient that they're enrolling in a trial because of how much they are being charged by the academic institutions where they're doing their study. You don't think there's some profit in that? I mean, these are nonprofit institutions, but they are absolutely marking up these trials because they can, because there's fierce competition for clinical trial sites. So our drug prices have to be as high as they are in order to afford R&D that is as high as it is in part because our nonprofit academic research institutions are charging as much as they are for each patient that they enroll, which is no doubt going to help fund care for a lot of other patients and subsidizing a lot of other treatments, right? As well as maybe some really nice lobbies. So if you see the totality of it all, it really becomes Byzantine, right? Like you appreciate how absurd it is, but it's actually clear. Like it is possible to wrap your mind around these things. You see the flow, the interconnectedness of it all, but you come to appreciate how near impossible it is for the average American to make sense of who to hold accountable for a patient not being able to afford a medicine that's right there appropriate for him. Just ask yourself, even if a copay for insulin is merely $35, why is it even $35? Who's faking diabetes to score free insulin? Ooh, that's fun to inject every day, right? But how many of us have ever asked about the morality of even a $35 copay? It was seen as a win. Oh, yeah, we lowered it to $35. But why even $35? Like, it is deterring some people from getting the insulin they need. Most people can afford $35, but some people can't. And all it takes is for one person to who needs that insulin and can't afford $35 to break all of our hearts. America has a ton of heart. As a country, we go mad when we hear about even one story of someone being treated unjustly. And we're prepared to tear everything down because of it, right? We act with our hearts. It's stupid. If it's a system that helps everybody else, we should not tear it down because of one story, and we certainly should study it and figure out what the right surgical fix is. But America kind of is impulsive. And so when they hear that one story, they say, oh, it's the drug companies. No, it's simply the question of skin in the game. Like, skin in the game makes sense for some things. It absolutely does not make sense when your doctor confirmed you've got diabetes, this is clearly the drug for you, you're taking the insulin that your PBM wants you to take because they negotiated a bigger rebate, you're doing everything everybody wants you to do, so why then is that final check? Are you sure you have diabetes? I mean, we're all sure you have diabetes, but like, let's be really sure that you're sure you have diabetes by seeing if you're willing to pay $35 for that insulin. Kind of evil, right? So, I hope you take that away with you and think about, whether you're working on inventing a medicine that somebody might try to joyride and fake having the condition, to take. If that seems absurd to you, then I hope that you not only invent your medicine, but make sure that when you finally launch it, that there's zero copay. That's going to take a little extracurricular work on your part.
Yeah. So thank you for presenting that situation so eloquently, Peter. So for our last question, we wanted to talk a little bit more about, you mentioned No Patient Left Behind. How do you envision No Patient Left Behind in terms of kind of solving this issue and kind of creating like kind of a better future in terms of this healthcare system?
Yeah, so when you create an organization like No Patient Left Behind, which is really a platform for a lot of people to volunteer their time, to get involved, and do things like, sometimes it's sign a letter, sign a petition conveying that you would not want to see a price control, but rather you'd want to see out-of-pocket caps passed. Maybe it means writing to your senator or congressman. Like, these are the acts of civic engagement, right? It's really an organization that helps people figure out what's within their power to do. We ultimately are pushing for insurance reform. You can do that simply by writing to an insurance company, or if, for example, do you know what Harvard's policies are in terms of insulin copayments? I don't actually know, but you could probably find out. The Harvard Biotech Club can go and find out, if somebody covered by Harvard's insurance has diabetes, what is their insulin copayment? And then, if it's anything higher than zero, just ask why. $5. Yeah, but why 5? How about 0, right? Or for anything, MS drugs, et cetera. Like, things like, nobody would fake these things to score, free infusions of, some CD20 inhibitor. Like, no one's going to be like, ooh, let's fake having wet AMD so we can get EYLEA injections in our eyeballs because, it's a 0 copay, so it'll be fun. Like, nobody's faking this stuff. And so if it turns out that Harvard is charging out-of-pocket costs, for people to get these medicines, just go ahead and ask Harvard why, right? Or any university or any company, right? Just get people to think about these things. That alone is already, a tactic. So pushing on this idea of like, why are there unnecessary out-of-pocket costs? It's one of the things we try to do. And frankly, we got to come up with the tools to make this fun. I have 0 TikTok skills. I hope some of you do. And if you can figure out how to spark these kinds of discussions and tap into the outrage people feel, about drug prices and affordability, and direct it where it belongs, at the question of why is insurance making people pay this, that would be doing some good. We have another campaign, which is not so much aimed at insurance reform, but aimed at trying to sort of address this misinformation that's coming out of the field of health economics, including here at Harvard, and I don't think MIT engages in this, maybe it does, but certainly at Harvard, there are people engaged in doing very simplified math that says, oh, this drug is overpriced. But if you go on the No Patient Left Behind website, you'll see a tab there on the value of medicines, and we talk about cost-effectiveness analysis. It looks at what is the benefit to a patient, like how many quality-adjusted life years, does a drug confer? If you live 2 years longer, that's 2 extra years, and if you kind of live at 80% of your quality of life and the drug bumps you up to 90%, that's a tenth of a quality, and if it does that for 10 years, then that's giving you like one quality's worth, right? So there's these ways of measuring the benefit that a drug gives you. And then they look at the price of the drug and they say, well, let's say the thresholds of $150,000 per quality is the upper limit of what we should pay. Okay, fine. I mean, technically there's an upper limit to what you would pay to save any life, right? Seatbelts. There was an estimate made of like what America spends on seatbelts to save however many lives, and I think the number was something like $10 million per life saved, due to all the expenditures on seatbelts. You could look at how much money we spend when a child falls down a well, what we won't do to rescue that child. So those are like ways of measuring what society is willing to spend to save a life. And so based on things like that, they infer like this must be the upper limit of what we should spend on drugs that confer a certain amount of benefit. But what they ignore is, for example, drugs go generic. So I get it if you're only going to spend $100,000, on hospital costs, to help people. That'll be, essentially there's an upper limit on the rent you're willing to spend on that, right? Because hospitals don't go generic. But if a drug costs you $200,000, but only costs you that for 14 years, and then it drops in price and it costs you like $100 a year after that as a generic, then that's more like a mortgage. You should integrate all of the qualities that you're going to gain over the next century and ultimately realize, it is well worth spending a ton of money today in order to get a century's worth of benefit. I mean, it's forever benefit. You think about it, it's how people talk about climate change. We should spend a ton of money to, create technologies today because, we got to look out the next 300 years. In fact, the U.S. government, to justify the climate tech incentives that they created in the Inflation Reduction Act, the same act that passed price controls on small molecule drugs, also provided huge incentives for creating climate tech, climate change responses. And those models looked out 300 years. And they said, it's worth spending more money today in order to save the future. But the models that they used to justify price controls on small molecules only looked out 10 years. Well, yeah, you're going to ignore all the benefits of those drugs after they've gone generic for the rest of humanity's existence, right? So your choice of model will ultimately spit out an answer that either makes you invest a ton of money to avert some future, forever crisis, or decide not to. And how is Alzheimer's all that different from climate change? It's this scary thing that's only going to grow, and it's going to cost us a ton of money. And if we don't spend now to invent, solutions and ways of averting it, it's going to cost us a fortune, right? They're not that different, economically, in terms of building a model. And so people within the government have the power to choose one model to justify spending a ton of money or another model to justify price controlling something and wiping it out. That is the power of central planners. And Harvard has people who encourage this kind of very skimpy math that ignores the fact that drugs go generic. It ignores the benefit of a treatment for caregivers. If somebody has cystic fibrosis, before the advent of a drug called Trikafta, that was an all-family thing, all hands on deck. That baby is getting the whole family's attention. It's going to be a lot harder for the parents to be productive, right? This drug now basically restores so much of that patient's health that their own caregivers can, go back to work and they can be productive. That patient can be productive. So these models ignore productivity. So we describe it on the No Patient Left Behind website as a flower. And each of these aspects of the value that a drug provides to society, the fact that it goes generic, the fact that it helps caregivers, the fact that it boosts productivity, these are like petals on a flower. And essentially, the health economists that would have you believe that all drugs in the US are overpriced are like people that have taken that flower that you're offering, stripped the petals off of it, and then held it up and said, this weed isn't worth paying for. But that's not fair. That's not what you have offered, is it? You offer the full flower. And so there are health economists out there that have advocated for the value flower with all of its petals. So this is a really wonky idea, but there are technocrats at the heart of our government that listen to things like this, and they are ultimately trying to decide, all right, fine, even if we reform insurance and no patient ever has to pay more than they can afford for an appropriate treatment, at the end of the day, how do we know that we're not all overpaying for these drugs? At the end of the day, if the whole town is paying, its taxes and they have a fire department and they're buying fire trucks, how do they know that they're not being collectively ripped off by the fire truck company that's charging too much for a fire truck? And so they're like, we need to do this math to figure out if we're overpaying. Well, you'd better do the comprehensive math, because if you choose to do skimpy math that ignores all the value, or a lot of the values, you will then insist, oh, I'm not going to pay very much. And then you will rob yourself of innovation that could have restored productivity to people. About 5 months ago or so, Kamala Harris put out as part of her campaign, she said, we're going to price control drugs, we're going to cut deeper into them because we need to generate the savings to pay for elder care. We need long-term care for our patients. Well, who can disagree with the need to provide long-term care for patients? Nobody wants to see, sick people kicked into the street, right? But who better to take care of you than you? Drugs can restore your own health, your own productivity, and you can care for yourself. That is essentially what Trikafta did. It turned every patient into their own caretaker, right? That's the best way to address, the need to look after people. And yet it sounded so nice, didn't it? Coming from a presidential candidate saying, we're going to price control these drugs for this good purpose. Well, don't fall for it. The government will save money here. They'll spend it on whatever, right? But as long as they couple it in their messaging, it's like, oh, yes, we should price control drugs. But the truth is, inventing a drug that really works. It cures people of diseases, turns them into their own caregiver, restores their productivity, their own dignity. Like, that's the best way to mobilize America's workforce, if you will, not leaving them sick and then having to train up tons more nurses to look after them. Like, we've got a lot of climate tech to build. We can't afford to be hiring more and more nurses into healthcare, right? There's other jobs to do. And medicines, ultimately keep people healthy and productive. So we've encouraged this field of generalized cost-effectiveness analysis, GCEA, instead of conventional cost-effectiveness analysis. The full value flower, not the skimpy one. And that too has been a No Patient Left Behind initiative. But the biggest initiative of all is one that if you go to the website and you click on Community Quest, it is how to tell stories that get America as a whole to be proud of the innovation that it is making possible, the grand quests to vanquish diseases, and try to inspire people in ways not unlike how other industries, whether it's the NFL or Elon Musk, inspires people by shooting a Tesla into orbit. I mean, there's zero utility to that. That's a wasted car. But God, was that cool, right? And people just want to watch, and they feel like they are a part of it. So some of them bought Teslas because there's one in orbit. I mean, it doesn't make sense, but this is how you build team spirit, right? And what does our industry do that's anything like that? Nothing yet. But what can we come up with?
Great. Well, thank you. I think that is the right note to end on. And we could talk on and on about drug pricing, for instance, but we don't want to hold you too long. So thank you so much, Peter, for being the debut guest for our podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Being a supporter since day one. And then also a special thank you to RA Capital for sponsoring this event as well.
Oh, how could we not?
Yeah, so thank you so much for always being a supporter. And I also want to thank everyone in the audience for coming for the debut podcast. It's so great to have you guys here in Serengeti at the Broad. And we'd also like to thank Michelle and Benita, our co-presidents, for supporting this initiative. Yeah, and then Monica, the Director of Networking, for help organizing this event. And then everyone at the Broad, AV, video recording facilities for making this event possible. So thank you so much for making this special event so special. And stay tuned for more info and more episodes for our podcast.
So that's the end of the debut episode for the Harvard Biotech Lab's The Pulse Podcast. First, I'd like to thank our guest, Peter Kolchinsky, for joining the live show. I want to thank Yusuf for co-hosting and helping produce this episode. Our next guest is Chris Ball, CEO of AI Proteins. Thank you for listening, and please stay tuned for our next episode.